In today's video, you'll learn how to make a fabric-lined knit face mask. This one is sized for adults. We've constructed this one working from side to side, starting with K1P1 ribbing on the left, seed stitch for the body with increases followed by decreases to create the shape, and then K1P1 ribbing on the right as well. We've used knit straps for this one that we've made and attached separately, but you can also use elastic or fabric ribbon closures. On the back, we have quilter's cotton. We've used a double layer of heavyweight fabric, and then we've hand sewn it into place. Now let's go through the materials list. First off, you'll need worsted weight yarn. We've used Red Heart Super Saver, and you can use any CYC weight for yarn that you have on hand. For your needles, please use whatever you need for gauge, which is listed in the pattern. But for this one, we've used US 7 4.5 millimeter knitting needles. You can use straight or circular, whatever you have on hand. You'll also need lining fabric. So an 11-inch by 12-inch piece of cotton, flannel, or high thread count bedding will work. To attach the lining, we've used all-purpose sewing thread. In this case, I've used Dual Duty XP. You'll also need a tapestry needle, a sewing needle, and of course a ruler, scissors, and pins to hold the fabric in place or clips. If you don't want to do a knit strap, you can actually use a 1/4 inch elastic, or you can use ribbon. 1/4 inch recommended as well. We'll walk you through that. You can find the free pattern PDF at yarnspirations.com. It has the gauge information and all the written instructions. To start, you'll cast on 16 stitches. You can use any cast on method that you are comfortable with. So now we have 16 stitches. We will begin our first row with K1P1 ribbing, and then we'll actually repeat that for 1 inch. So it's just a normal K1, P1, and repeat across the row. So our first row is completed, and then we're actually going to keep doing that for 1 inch, ending on a wrong side row. That first row was our right side row. So we've now worked in K1P1 ribbing for 1 inch, which means we can continue with the pattern, starting with our increases and changing over to seed stitch. So for this first row, we're going to do KFB, which is knit front and back. So for that, we're going to insert our needle, wrap the yarn around the needle, pull through, and then actually knit into the back as well of that stitch, and then slide off. Then we're going to do K1, P1, and repeat to the last stitch. We're about to approach the last stitch, and again we're going to work a KFB, so a knit front and back in this last one here to increase it. So again, you're just going into the front of that stitch as if you're making a normal knit stitch, then you're bringing your needle around and knitting into the back of that stitch as well. So we've now gone up to 18 stitches. For the second row, we're just going to do P1, K1, and that's the basis of starting our seed stitch pattern. We're now going to start the third row, which is going to be K1, P1. A tip for seed stitch: when you see a bump, that's the purl, so you'll know you have to knit. Whenever you see the little knit stitch, you know you have to purl. So you're basically doing the reverse of what you see. So we're going to work in pattern. We've come to the end of the third row where we've worked K1, P1. Those last 2 rows form the basis of the seed stitch pattern. When you're working seed stitch and you see the instructions say work even in pat, that means that you're going to purl your knits. So this here is a knit stitch and you're going to purl it, and every time you see that bump, which is a purl stitch, you're going to knit it. So that's all that means. You'll continue working in the pattern, and then on select rows where it's written, so on the 5th row, 9th row, 17th row, and so on, you're going to work a KFB, so the knit front and back on the first and last stitches of that row, and that'll increase your stitch count by 2. We'll meet back again at the 27th row. We're now at our 27th row and are ready to begin our decreases. For the decrease, the first one that we're working is an SSK. So that's made by slipping the first 2 stitches off the needle and then knitting through both of them. So we're going to slip it as if we were going to knit it. So we put our needle through that loop and slide it off, and then we put our needle through the next loop and slide it off. And then we actually slide those 2 stitches from our right needle back onto the left needle. And so I tend to use my left hand needle to help pick them up one at a time. So now they're back on the left needle and the loops have kind of changed the direction, and we're going to take our right needle and work through the back loop of both of those stitches so that they're worked together as one. Wrap our yarn around the needle and knit that normally. Then we're actually going to continue in pattern until we hit the last 2 stitches. So knit 1, purl 1, and then continue. We've reached the end of our 27th row, which is our first decrease row. We have 2 stitches remaining on the needle. For this, we're going to work a K2 tog, or a knit 2 together. So we'll just insert our needle through both of the next 2 stitches as if they were one, and work them as a normal knit stitch. We've decreased it, and you can see it forms a right leaning decrease, whereas the SSK forms a left leaning decrease. So you'll continue working even in pattern until we get to the 35th row, where we work a slightly different decrease. We're at the start of our 35th row, which is another decrease row. For this one, we're going to do an SSK again. So slip, slip, knit. So we'll put those 2 back on our needle and then knit through back there. We'll work even in pattern for the rest of the row until we get to the last 2 stitches. So P1, K1, and repeat that to the last 2. We've reached the end of the row and we're going to work a P2 tog or purl 2 together. It's very similar to a knit 2 together, except we'll purl the next 2 stitches as if they are one. So that decreases 1 stitch, and we decreased 1 earlier with the SSK at the beginning of the row. So you'll continue working decrease rows as indicated on the pattern, working even in seed stitch for the remaining stitches. We'll continue after the 51st row when you're at 16 stitches with P1, K1 ribbing. We're at the end of the 51st row and we've worked our last decrease row, so we're down to 16 stitches. From here, we're going to proceed in P1, K1 ribbing for an inch, so that'll match the beginning. So to start, it's just the same as we've done before, except purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. So you'll continue that for 1 inch and then roll cast off in ribbing. So we've done our P1, K1 ribbing for 1 inch, and now we're going to cast off in ribbing. So essentially, it's like most other cast offs, except you're going to purl your purl stitches and knit your knit stitches in pattern. So, for example, purl 1, knit 1, and we'll slip that first stitch over. The next stitch is a purl stitch, so we'll work it as a purl, and then slip the previous stitch over it. Again, we hit a knit stitch, so we'll knit that and then slip the previous stitch over. So continue that across the row. With that, we've finished the body of our mask. I'm just going to cut my thread and fasten off the end. And here we have the body of the mask. So from here, we'll work on the straps and then the lining. For the knit ties, you'll cast on 80 stitches. So you'll cast on as you would for the beginning of a project. So we've cast on 80 stitches and we're going to immediately cast off, and that'll form our first knit strap. So you cast off exactly as you would any other project. We're just at the end of our cast off for our first strap. And we'll loop through that end to secure it. And you can see here we have our first strap. To attach the straps, we'll take our tapestry needle and thread one of the ends of the strap through there. We'll go to the reverse, the wrong side of our mask, and we'll line up the edge of the mask with one of the straps and we'll sew it into place. So I'll kind of work under and around the stitches that line up with the edge of the mask with the strap, and it's almost like a whip stitch, but not quite, to hold it in place. However you tack it down, just make sure it's very secure because you don't want it coming out. Once you've secured it in place, you'll need to weave your ends in just like you would with a normal project. Once you've completed your first strap, you'll need to repeat those instructions for the remaining 3 corners. At this point, we'll work on our lining, and I've put down a colored mat so you can see it more clearly. We have a template in the pattern PDF. You can print it at 100% scale, but if you don't have access to a printer, you can draw it out, noting that each square is equal to 1 inch. For this, you'll cut it out and then trace it onto fabric. We've used heavyweight quilter's cotton. Once you trace it out and cut out the shapes, you should have 2 shapes that look like this, and you'll stack them. Once you stack them, you'll need to turn under 1/4 of an inch. So I typically press that down with my finger, but I find it helpful to trace or draw on your fabric 1/4 of an inch so you have a guideline. Here is an example where I've done that already. You can see that I have some pencil marks for where I indicated there was 1/4 of an inch, and I pressed it down. To save time, if you're making a bunch of these, you can actually iron this in place. So you'll see here all the raw ends are turned under, and we're ready to attach it to the wrong side of our mask. So we've got the wrong side of our mask here, and we'll lay this on and center it as best we can. And at this point, if you've got pins, I would pin it into place. We've pinned our fabric in place, and you can see that all the curves have been turned under. If you have any trouble getting your fabric to lay flat because the fabric is really thick, you can take your scissors and clip where those curves are, and that'll help it lay a bit flatter. Because we've worked with heavyweight quilter's cotton, we haven't really had that issue, and especially if you iron or press it into place, it should be okay. At this point, we'll take our sewing needle and our thread and make a knot on the end of the thread to secure it. However you normally make a knot. And we'll start in the corner of our fabric and secure it on the wrong side. For our whip stitch, the initial stitch, we want it to come out of the fabric, so I'm pulling the needle through just in that corner. And then our whip stitches are formed on a diagonal, so we'll work through the yarn up on the right hand side and then come back straight through to the fabric in front of it. And you don't need to actually catch a lot of that fabric. So if you can see here, we're just going into that corner there. And I'll remove this pin as we don't need that in place anymore. And you'll again work on the diagonal, taking a little bit of the yarn from the lining or from the backing and a little bit of the fabric. And you'll continue that process all the way around. My stitches are spaced about 1/4 of an inch apart. You can do whatever works to keep the lining in place and feel secure. And you want to pull snugly, but not so tight that it causes your fabric to pucker. We have a finished sample here that shows the lining held in place by the whip stitch, and we've gone all the way around. We'll actually bring back the work in progress though, so we can show you alternate methods of straps. So say for example, you wanted to work with a 1/4 inch elastic, you would need approximately a 6-inch piece, and you would attach it to the wrong side of your mask in a loop. So you want to make sure that your loop does not twist so that it can actually go over evenly. To avoid it from twisting, we're going to pin it in place. If you have an elastic that tends to fray, you can use like one of those liquid sealants to secure the ends and prevent it from unraveling in the future, or you can fold under the elastic so that it's doubled up. So there are a few different ways that you can secure the elastic. You can work a whip stitch like we did before, and that'll keep it in place. And then when you get to, I'm going to remove the pin now so that's not in the way. And from here you can sort of do a running stitch if you want, or you can do an X to hold the whole thing down. So essentially you'll keep sewing that down just to ensure that it's secured in place. And repeat that process for the other strap. Now we'll take a look at the ribbon. So if you're going to use a ribbon, it's essentially the same idea. We recommend an 18-inch length so you have enough room to tie it. If the ends of your ribbon tend to fray, you can use one of those liquid sealants, or you can fold it under and pin it into place on your mask. And again, you can use a whip stitch to go around and just do an X to tack it down, anything that will keep it in place. And that's all it takes to make one of these masks. If you have any questions or comments, leave them for us below. Thank you for watching.